He thought I was powerless, and that was the only reason he dared to laugh. The crystal glasses chimed softly around us, polite applause echoing through the restaurant as if nothing unusual had happened, but I remember every second of that moment with perfect clarity, the way Jason Miller leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips as he looked at me like I was something temporary, something replaceable, something small, and then he said it, just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, "You always try, Emily, but somehow it's never quite enough. Is it?" A few quiet laughs followed, hesitant at first, then growing, because people tend to follow confidence, even when it's cruel, and I could feel their eyes on me, waiting, expecting a reaction, a defense, a crack, but I gave them nothing, not a word, not even a shift in posture, just a calm sip of my drink, measured, controlled, deliberate, and that was the moment everything changed, though none of them realized it yet, not Jason, not Olivia watching me from across the table with that curious tilt of her head, not even the waiter who paused a fraction too long beside us sensing the tension beneath the surface, because what looked like silence was never weakness, it was timing, and as the seconds stretched and Jason's confidence grew, I let him believe he had one. I let him think I was exactly who he wanted me to be, because the truth was already in motion, quietly unfolding behind the scenes, and the only question left was how long it would take before he realized exactly who he had just underestimated. Jason kept talking as if the night belonged to him, his voice smooth, confident, completely unaware that every word was only tightening something invisible around him, and I watched it happen with quiet precision, noting the way Mark Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the way Olivia Bennett glanced between us as though she could sense a current she could not quite name, and still I said nothing, because silence, when used properly, is louder than any argument, and Jason mistook it for surrender, which made him bolder. Honestly, he continued, lifting his glass with a careless smile. I suppose not everyone is built for this kind of life, and there it was again, another small cut disguised as charm, another moment designed to make me shrink, and yet I didn't, not this time, because I already knew what was coming next, and more importantly, I knew something he didn't. My phone buzzed lightly against the table, subtle enough that no one else noticed, but I felt it instantly, a single message lighting up the screen for half a second before I turned it face down again. Everything is ready, and just beneath it, a name that would have meant nothing to anyone else in that room, but meant everything to me, Richard Carter, and for a brief moment, I let myself breathe, slow and steady, because that message was not just confirmation, it was a countdown, and across from me, Jason smiled like a man who believed he was untouchable, who believed this evening would end exactly the way he had planned, with him in control and me quietly diminished, but control is a fragile illusion, and as the laughter around the table softened into polite conversation again, I realized something almost amusing. He was performing, trying to impress an audience that had already begun to notice the cracks, and he had no idea that the stage beneath him was about to shift, completely, irreversibly, and when it did, there would be no applause left to hide behind. There is a precise moment when confidence begins to turn into carelessness, and Jason had just crossed it without realizing, his voice growing louder, his gestures broader, as though the room existed solely to reflect him back at himself, and yet the energy had shifted, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly. Olivia no longer smiled the way she had earlier, her fingers resting still against her glass, watching, analyzing, while Mark Reynolds avoided direct eye contact altogether, choosing instead to focus on the table, on his drink, on anything that did not require him to engage, because somewhere beneath Jason's performance, the truth was beginning to press against the surface, and people could feel it even if they could not yet explain it, and I let the silence stretch just a fraction longer than comfortable, because discomfort reveals more than confrontation ever could. Then finally, I tilted my head slightly, meeting Jason's gaze with a calm that did not match the role he had assigned to me, and that was when he hesitated, just for a second, barely noticeable, but enough to tell me he felt it too, the shift, the imbalance, the subtle loss of control. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice even, measured, almost polite, and the table fell quiet in a way that laughter never quite achieves, because now they were listening, not to him, but to me, and Jason gave a small laugh, attempting to recover. "What is that supposed to mean?" he replied, but the confidence in his tone had thinned, and I could see it clearly now, the first crack, the beginning of doubt, and I did not rush, I did not press, because timing matters, and instead I simply glanced, briefly, toward Mark, just long enough for him to notice, just long enough for the tension in his shoulders to tighten, and that was all it took, because secrets rarely stay hidden when the right person feels seen, and in that moment, without raising my voice, without changing my posture, I shifted the entire direction of the evening, and Jason still believed he was in control, which made what came next even more inevitable. Jason tried to laugh it off, but it came a fraction too late, a fraction too forced, and that was all anyone needed to feel that something had shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to unsettle the rhythm he had been so carefully controlling, and I could see it in the way Olivia leaned back slightly, her expression no longer entertained but curious, observant, while Mark's grip on his glass tightened just enough to betray him, a detail most would miss, but not me, never me, because this was the part people underestimate, the quiet observation before the collapse, and Jason, still clinging to the illusion of authority, straightened his posture as if that alone could restore balance. "You are being dramatic now, Emily," he said, attempting to regain ground, but his words no longer landed the same way. They hovered, uncertain, waiting for validation that did not come, and I let that silence answer for me, just long enough to let doubt grow in the space between us. Then I spoke again, softer this time, but sharper. "It is interesting," I said, tilting my head slightly as if considering something trivial, "how confident people can be when they believe no one is paying attention," and that was when Mark looked up. Instinctively, his eyes meeting mine for half a second before darting away, and Jason noticed, of course he did, because control makes people sensitive to disruption, and suddenly his attention shifted, not entirely, but enough for suspicion to take root. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, and there it was, the question he did not want to ask but could not avoid, because somewhere beneath his certainty, he had begun to realize that I was no longer reacting to him. I was guiding him, slowly, deliberately, and the worst part for him was that he could not see how far ahead I already was, and as the room grew quieter, as the polite atmosphere dissolved into something far more fragile, I allowed myself the smallest pause, just enough to let anticipation build, because once the first thread is pulled, everything else begins to unravel, and he had just given me exactly what I needed. The moment a question is asked in a room like that, everything changes, because questions invite attention, and attention exposes what confidence tries to hide, and Jason had just placed himself exactly where I needed him, waiting for an answer he was not prepared to hear, and I did not rush to give it, because anticipation is far more powerful than explanation. Instead I let my gaze drift briefly across the table, acknowledging each person without speaking. Olivia, composed but alert, Mark, increasingly uneasy, and then back to Jason, who was now watching me with a focus that bordered on concern, and that was new, that was important, because concern meant doubt, and doubt meant the beginning of loss. "I am not implying anything," I said calmly, my tone even, almost reassuring, which made it far more unsettling. "I am simply observing," and for a moment, that seemed to confuse him more than confrontation would have, because there was nothing concrete to challenge. Nothing to dismiss, only a feeling that something beneath the surface was shifting beyond his control, and then, as if on cue, Mark cleared his throat softly, a small, involuntary sound that carried far more weight than he intended, and Jason turned towards him instantly, instinctively searching for confirmation, for alignment, for anything that would restore the balance he had lost, but Mark did not meet his eyes this time, and that absence spoke louder than any accusation ever could, and I could see it now, the realization forming, slow but undeniable. Something was wrong, something had changed, and he did not know what, and that uncertainty began to unravel him in ways no direct challenge ever could, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, relaxed, composed, entirely at ease, because the hardest part was never exposing the truth, it was letting someone realize, piece by piece, that they had already been standing in it all along, and Jason was just beginning to understand that. This was no longer his stage, not tonight, not anymore. There is always a moment when silence stops protecting and starts exposing, and I could feel that moment settling over the table like a quiet pressure, subtle but impossible to ignore. Jason's confidence now replaced with something far less stable, a careful watchfulness that betrayed how quickly certainty can fade when it is no longer supported, and he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if that might contain whatever was unfolding. "If you have something to say, Emily, just say it," he insisted, but the edge in his tone revealed more than the words themselves, because this was no longer about control, it was about needing clarity, needing reassurance, and I offered neither. Instead I allowed a small, almost thoughtful smile to appear, not mocking, not warm, simply knowing. And that unsettled him more than anything else could have, because it suggested understanding he did not share. And across the table, Olivia shifted again, this time leaning in, drawn into the tension. While Mark remained still, almost too still, as if movement alone might draw attention to him, and that alone was enough, because in rooms like this, people do not need explanations, they read behavior, they notice hesitation, they connect fragments, and suddenly Jason was no longer the center of admiration, he was the center of curiosity, and curiosity can be dangerous when it is pointed in the wrong direction. "You are making this uncomfortable," he added, attempting to regain authority, but it landed differently now, almost defensive, almost uncertain, and I let a brief pause settle before responding, just long enough to let everyone feel the weight of his words. "No," I said quietly, my voice steady, unwavering. "I think it already was," and that was the shift, the undeniable one, because in that instant, the narrative changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, and Jason felt it. I could see it in the way his expression tightened, in the way his certainty faltered, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer sure how this would end, and that uncertainty was exactly where I needed him to be. Uncertainty does not arrive all at once, it builds quietly, tightening around every assumption until even the most confident person begins to question what they thought they understood, and Jason was feeling it now. I could see it in the way he adjusted his posture again, no longer relaxed but measured, controlled, as if he were recalibrating in real time, trying to find the version of himself that would restore order, but the room had already moved beyond that point, because once people begin to sense a shift, they do not return to what was comfortable, they lean into what is revealing, and Olivia was watching me now, not with sympathy, not even with concern, but with interest, the kind that comes when someone realizes there is more beneath the surface than they had first assumed. While Mark remained caught between presence and absence, physically there but mentally retreating, and that alone spoke volumes, because silence from the wrong person is never neutral, and Jason knew it. Even if he could not yet explain why, "You are overcomplicating this," he said, attempting once more to simplify the situation, to reduce it to something manageable, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty. It was thinner now, edged with something close to urgency, and I let that linger, let the contrast between his tone and his earlier confidence become undeniable, because people notice inconsistency far more than they notice confrontation, and then, slowly, deliberately, I reached for my glass, taking a measured sip before setting it back down with quiet precision, every movement intentional, every second controlled, and when I finally spoke again, my voice remained calm, almost reflective. "It is not complicated at all," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "It is actually very simple," and that was enough to pull everyone in completely, because simplicity, when promised at the right moment, feels like revelation, and Jason leaned forward slightly without realizing it, drawn in despite himself, needing to hear what came next, needing to understand what he had missed, and that need, that quiet urgency, was the clearest sign that the balance of power had already shifted, even if he had not yet accepted it. The most dangerous moment in any conversation is not when the truth is revealed, but when it is about to be understood, and I could feel that edge now, the exact point where curiosity turns into realization, where silence begins to carry meaning that words cannot soften, and Jason was leaning forward, not aggressively, but instinctively, drawn in by something he could no longer dismiss, his expression no longer confident, no longer amused, but searching, calculating, trying to piece together fragments that refused to align, and I let him sit in that space for just a second longer, because that is where control truly shifts, not in what is said, but in what is felt before it is spoken. And across the table, Olivia had gone completely still, her attention fixed, while Mark's composure had started to fracture in small but undeniable ways, his fingers tapping once against the glass before stopping abruptly, as if he had realized even that was too much, and that was when I spoke again. Quieter now, but unmistakably deliberate. "You see," I said, my voice steady, almost reflective, "confidence only works when it is built on something real," and Jason's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, because now he was listening differently, no longer waiting to respond, but needing to understand, and that difference changes everything. "And when it is not," I continued, holding his gaze without hesitation, "it starts to slip the moment someone notices," and there it was, the shift from implication to direction, subtle but precise, guiding the room toward a conclusion without forcing it, and Jason felt it immediately, his posture tightening, his attention flicking, briefly, toward Mark again, because somewhere, instinctively, he had begun to connect the pieces, even if he did not want to, even if he was not ready to, and I allowed a small pause, just enough for that connection to settle, just enough for doubt to solidify into something far more difficult to ignore, because once someone begins to question the foundation of their confidence, everything else begins to follow, and Jason was standing right at the edge of that realization, whether he chose to step into it or not. Realization rarely arrives as a single moment, it unfolds in fragments, each one harder to ignore than the last, and I could see Jason assembling them now, slowly, unwillingly, his gaze shifting between me and Mark with increasing precision, no longer casual, no longer confident, but searching for confirmation he was not ready to find, and the room felt different, quieter in a way that carried weight, as if every person present had instinctively understood that something important was about to surface, and I did not interrupt that process, because interruption would have given him space to recover, to dismiss, to deflect, and I had no intention of allowing that. Instead I let the silence stretch just enough to make every small movement noticeable, the way Mark adjusted his sleeve without looking up, the way Olivia's attention sharpened as she leaned in slightly, drawn by the tension rather than repelled by it, and Jason noticed all of it, of course he did, because once doubt enters, awareness follows, and suddenly nothing feels neutral anymore. This is ridiculous, he said, but the words lacked conviction, they felt like an attempt rather than a statement, and that difference was everything, because now he was not leading the conversation, he was reacting to it, and I met his gaze calmly, without urgency, without pressure, because the truth does not need to be forced when it is already visible, is it? I asked softly, not challenging, not confrontational, just enough to make him question his own certainty, and that was when it happened, not a dramatic break, not an obvious reaction, but something far more telling. Mark exhaled quietly, a controlled breath that came a fraction too late, and Jason heard it, his eyes snapping toward him in an instant, and in that brief exchange, everything aligned, not fully, not completely, but enough for suspicion to turn into something far more concrete, and I watched it settle in his expression, the shift from confusion to understanding, slow, reluctant, but undeniable, because once the first truth is seen, the rest cannot remain hidden for long, and Jason had just seen enough to realize that this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something he could not control. The moment suspicion finds a direction, it becomes impossible to ignore, and Jason had just reached that point, his attention no longer divided, no longer uncertain, but fixed, locked onto Mark with a sharpness that revealed everything he was beginning to understand, and the shift was immediate, subtle in movement but unmistakable in presence, because now he was no longer performing for the room, he was searching for answers, and that change stripped away the confidence he had relied on from the very beginning. Is there something you want to explain? He asked, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with something far more fragile than authority, and Mark hesitated, not dramatically, not enough for someone untrained to notice, but long enough, just long enough, and hesitation in the wrong moment is louder than any confession, and the room felt it, Olivia's gaze flickering between them, her earlier curiosity now sharpened into understanding, while I remained still, composed, allowing the silence to do what words never could, because this was no longer my revelation, it was his, and that distinction mattered. I do not know what you think you are implying, Mark replied carefully, but even his tone lacked the ease it once carried, and Jason heard it, of course he did, because once doubt becomes awareness, every detail confirms it, every pause, every shift, every choice of word, and I could see it clearly now, the moment his certainty collapsed entirely, replaced by something far more dangerous, the need to know the full truth, and I let that moment breathe, let it expand until it filled the space between us, because this was where the balance of power fully turned, not in confrontation, but in realization, and as Jason's gaze moved back to me, searching, demanding clarity without asking for it directly, I met his eyes without hesitation, calm, steady, already beyond the point of doubt, because what he was only beginning to understand, I had known all along, and now there was no way for him to return to who he had been at the start of the evening. There is a point where silence is no longer enough, where the truth has gathered too much weight to remain unspoken, and I could feel that moment settle fully into place, the room no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but waiting for the final piece that would make everything undeniable, and Jason's gaze had changed completely now, No trace of earlier arrogance, only a sharp, restless focus, as though he were trying to hold onto something that was already slipping beyond his reach. And that was when I decided to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that carried further than any raised voice ever could. "You asked for something simple," I said, my tone steady, composed, giving nothing away except certainty. "So here it is." And even before I continued, the air shifted again, anticipation tightening around every word, every breath, because people recognize when the truth is about to surface, even if they do not yet know what it is. "You built your confidence on the assumption that no one was paying attention," I continued, meeting Jason's gaze directly, unwavering. "But you were wrong, and I let that settle, let it land fully before moving forward, because timing is everything. When the truth finally begins to reveal itself, someone was always watching." And at that, Jason's expression changed again, something sharper, more alert, as if a specific possibility had just crossed his mind, and I saw it, that flicker of realization that connected him, however briefly, to something beyond this table, beyond this room, and that was enough to move to the final step. "You should have been more careful about who you trusted," I said quietly, my voice no longer reflective but precise, directed. And that was when Mark finally broke, not with words, not with a confession, but with something far more telling, a shift in posture, a glance away, a silent admission that confirmed everything without needing to say it. And in that moment, the truth was no longer hidden, it was present, undeniable, and Jason knew it, even if he had not yet found the words to face it. The truth does not need to be repeated once it has been seen, and in that moment, no one at the table needed further explanation, because everything had already aligned, every glance, every hesitation, every misplaced confidence now forming a complete picture that could not be undone, and Jason felt it fully, the weight of it settling into his expression, not explosive, not dramatic, but quiet in a way that revealed something far deeper, the loss of control, the collapse of certainty, the realization that the narrative he had been shaping all evening no longer belonged to him. And I did not press further, because I did not need to. The silence now worked in my favor, steady, composed, final, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to stand, slow and deliberate, the movement drawing every eye without demand, without effort, because attention follows resolution, and this was mine, not his. "You see," I said calmly, my voice carrying just enough to be heard, just enough to close what had been opened. "Silence is only mistaken for weakness by those who do not understand it," and I let that settle, not as a challenge, not as a victory, but as a truth that required no defense. And Jason did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left that would change what had already been revealed, and that was the difference, the final shift, the undeniable end of what he believed this evening would be. And as I turned to leave, I caught a brief reflection of myself in the glass beside us, composed, steady, unchanged in appearance yet entirely different in presence, because this had never been about proving anything to them, it had always been about understanding my own position, my own strength, and choosing the exact moment to reveal it. And as I stepped away from the table, leaving behind the quiet aftermath of a truth fully realized, one thing became unmistakably clear: I had not been silent because I was powerless, I had been silent because I already knew exactly how this would end.